The moment I walked into my backyard and saw the neon orange sticker plastered across my propane tank, I knew my peaceful existence in the Meadowbrook Estates community was about to get complicated. I had been living in this gated development outside Phoenix, Arizona for 3 years, and until recently, things had been relatively calm. Sure, there were the usual HOA quirks like mandatory beige mailboxes and restrictions on Christmas decorations after January 1st, but nothing too invasive. That all changed when Nancy Henderson became the HOA president 6 months ago. Nancy was the kind of woman who wore pressed khakis to neighborhood barbecues and carried a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws in her oversized purse at all times. The sticker on my propane tank read, "Violation. Propane tanks within 25 feet of any structure prohibited. Remove immediately or face fines. I am Blake Jensen, a 42-year-old mechanical engineer who spent most of my career designing HVAC systems for commercial buildings. If anyone understood heating systems and safety regulations, it was me." This propane tank had been in the exact same spot since I moved in, sitting peacefully next to my outdoor kitchen area, about 8 feet from my house. It powered my grill, and more importantly, it connected to a line that ran underground to the community's welcome center. Let me explain that part because it is crucial to what happened next. When I bought my property, the previous owner had struck a deal with the HOA. His lot sat at the corner of the development, adjacent to the welcome center, which was basically a glorified clubhouse with a kitchen, meeting rooms, and a small gym. The builder had originally planned to run natural gas lines throughout the development, but costs got out of hand, and they scrapped the idea halfway through construction. My property ended up being one of the few with the infrastructure already in place. The welcome center had been built without any heating system for the kitchen appliances. The previous owner, a guy named Tom who apparently loved being the neighborhood hero, had offered to supply propane from his property to the welcome center through an underground line. He paid for the installation, got the proper permits from the city, and everyone was happy. When I bought the house, that arrangement transferred to me. I got a slight reduction in my monthly HOA fees in exchange for maintaining the propane supply. For 3 years, this setup worked perfectly. I refilled the tank every few months, kept meticulous maintenance records, and the welcome center had heat and working appliances. Nancy Henderson either didn't know about this arrangement or didn't care. I pulled the sticker off my tank and walked straight to the HOA office, which was located in the welcome center. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to argue about the propane tank that literally heated the building I was entering. Nancy sat behind the reception desk, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that seemed to pull her entire face upward. She was typing furiously on her computer, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Nancy, we need to talk about this violation notice," I said, holding up the orange sticker. She looked up, and I swear I saw her eyes light up with the kind of joy people usually reserve for winning the lottery. "Mr. Jensen, yes, I was hoping you would come by. That propane tank is a serious safety hazard. It has been there for over 6 years. The previous owner installed it with proper permits. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," Nancy said, standing up and pulling out a thick binder from beneath her desk. "I have been conducting a comprehensive review of our community standards, and I discovered that we have been far too lax in enforcement. Propane tanks are highly explosive. Having one so close to a residential structure violates basic safety protocols. The city fire marshal approved the installation. I have all the documentation. The HOA has its own standards, Mr. Jensen. As you know from your deed restrictions, the HOA rules supersede local regulations in matters of community aesthetics and safety. She flipped through the binder, her manicured nail tapping on a specific paragraph. Right here. Section 8, subsection 4. No propane tanks, gas canisters, or similar containers shall be visible or stored within 25 feet of any structure. That rule was added last month, I said, having done my homework before coming here. It wasn't in the original covenants. The board voted on it and it passed unanimously. You should attend the meetings, Mr. Jensen. We sent out notices. I was in Chicago for work during that meeting. And even if the rule is valid, you cannot just apply it retroactively without a grace period for existing installations. This isn't just about my grill, Nancy. That tank supplies propane to this building. Her expression faltered for just a moment. What are you talking about? The welcome center. The stove in the kitchen. The heater in the storage room. It all runs off my propane tank through an underground line. Check your records. The HOA has been getting subsidized heating for 3 years because of an agreement with the previous owner. Nancy's face flushed red, and she began flipping through another folder on her desk. After several minutes of increasingly frantic searching, she looked back up at me. I see some notes here about a gas line, but this cannot be right. You are saying the HOA is dependent on your personal propane tank. That is exactly what I am saying. The previous owner installed it, got all the proper permits, and the HOA agreed to reduce my fees by $75 a month in exchange. It has been working fine for years. This is completely unacceptable, Nancy said, her voice rising. The HOA cannot be reliant on a homeowner's private utility supply. That creates all sorts of liability issues. Maybe you should have thought of that before slapping a violation notice on my tank. You want me to move it more than 25 feet from any structure. Fine. But when I disconnect it, you won't have heat or a working stove. You cannot do that. We have events scheduled. The women's auxiliary meets here every Tuesday. We have a cooking class this weekend. Then I suggest you delay enforcing this new rule until the HOA can arrange for its own propane supply. Or better yet, acknowledge that this is a special circumstance and grandfather in my existing installation. Nancy's jaw tightened. She closed the binder with a sharp snap. The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Jensen. No exceptions. You have until the end of the week to relocate that tank beyond 25 feet from your house, or you will be fined $250 per day. I felt my own anger rising but kept my voice level. If I move that tank, I will have to disconnect the line to the welcome center. The geography of my property means there is nowhere I can place it that is both 25 feet from my house and still able to maintain a connection here. That sounds like your problem, not mine. Actually, it is about to become very much your problem. I left the office and spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the agreement in my property documents. Everything was there in black and white. The underground line, the reduced fees, the maintenance responsibilities. I also pulled up the permits from the city, which clearly showed that the installation met all safety codes. The tank was properly secured, had adequate ventilation, and posed no more risk than the thousands of similar setups across Phoenix. But Nancy had made her position clear. She wanted the tank moved, consequences be damned. That evening I called my friend Derek, who owned a plumbing and gas fitting company. I need you to come out and disconnect a propane line for me. Sure, man. When do you need it done? How about tomorrow morning? And bring your permit book. I want everything documented properly. Derek arrived at 8 a.m. the next day with his assistant and a truck full of equipment. I showed him the setup, explained the situation with the HOA, and he shook his head. Nancy Henderson, Yeah, I have heard about her. My sister lives in Pinewood Crossing, and their HOA president is the same type. Made everyone repaint their front doors because the shade of white was not uniform. He knelt down by the propane tank and inspected the connection. This is a really nice installation. Professional grade work. Shame to disconnect it. The HOA made their choice. I am just complying with their rules. While Derek worked on disconnecting the underground line and capping it properly, I took photographs of everything. I documented the orange violation sticker, the propane tank, the underground connection point, and had Derek photograph the disconnect process. I had a feeling I would need evidence of exactly what happened and when. The process took about 3 hours. Derek had to dig down to access the connection point, properly cap both ends of the line, and then help me move the propane tank to a new location. We measured carefully and placed it exactly 26 feet from my house, right at the back corner of my property. It was completely useless there for my outdoor kitchen, but it satisfied the letter of Nancy's rule. "What about the welcome center?" Derek asked as we finished. "They are going to figure out pretty quick that they have no heat." I imagined so, but I tried to warn Nancy. She didn't want to listen. Derek shook his head and handed me the paperwork documenting the disconnect. "Rather you than me, brother. Good luck with this." The weather in Phoenix during late January is usually mild, with daytime temperatures in the 60s and 70s. But at night, it can drop down into the 40s, and the welcome center was not well insulated. I knew from maintaining the system that the building relied on that propane connection for both the kitchen stove and 3 small heaters that kept the place comfortable during events. 2 days after I disconnected the line, my phone rang. It was Nancy. "Mr. Jensen, the stove is not working at the welcome center." "I am aware. When I moved the propane tank to comply with your violation notice, I had to disconnect the supply line. I told you this would happen. You need to reconnect it immediately." "I cannot do that. The tank is now 26 feet from my house, but that puts it almost 70 feet from the welcome center. The line won't reach, and even if it would, extending it would require new permits and probably cost $15,000 to $20,000. You would need to approve that expense." There was a long silence on the other end. "You did this deliberately." "I did exactly what you told me to do. I moved the propane tank beyond 25 feet from any structure. You never asked about the implications for the welcome center, and frankly, after you dismissed my concerns, I figured you had a plan. This is sabotage. This is compliance. Check with your board. Check with the city." Everything I did was properly permitted and documented. "You created this situation, Nancy." She hung up without another word. I expected some kind of retaliation, but I underestimated how quickly things would escalate. That evening, I found a letter taped to my front door. It was a formal notice informing me that I was being fined $5,000 for willful destruction of HOA property and interruption of community services. The letter was completely absurd. I had not destroyed anything. I had legally disconnected a line that ran from my property to theirs, following all proper procedures. The fact that they had been relying on my private property for their utilities was their problem, not mine. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morris who specialized in property law. I had used her services when I first bought the house to review all the documents, and she had warned me then that the HOA had some unusually broad language in their covenants. "Blake, good to hear from you," Patricia said when she picked up. "What has the HOA done now?" I explained the entire situation, from the orange sticker to the disconnection to Nancy's phone call and the fine. Patricia listened without interrupting, and I could hear her typing notes. "Okay, this is interesting. Send me copies of everything. The original agreement with the previous owner, the permits for the installation, the new HOA rule, the violation notice, and this fine letter. Also send me the documentation from your gas fitter showing the proper disconnection. You think I have a case? I think you have several cases. First, they cannot fine you for complying with their own rules. Second, they cannot retroactively apply a new regulation to existing permitted installations without proper notice and a reasonable compliance timeline. Third, and this is the big one, they have been unjustly enriched by using your private property to supply utilities to their building without proper compensation. That $75 monthly reduction in your HOA fees. I bet it doesn't come close to covering the actual cost of the propane you have been supplying. I never really calculated it. Well, I suggest you start. Go back through your records and figure out exactly how much propane you have provided to the Welcome Center over the past 3 years. Calculate the market value. Then we are going to send the HOA a very detailed letter explaining exactly how much they owe you, and how their new rule has effectively terminated an agreement that was highly favorable to them. I spent that night digging through 3 years of receipts and propane delivery records. My tank held 500 gallons, and I typically had it refilled 3 to 4 times per year. I used some of that propane for my grill, but the bulk of it went to the Welcome Center through the underground line. Based on my usage patterns before and after I bought the house, I estimated that roughly 70% of my propane consumption was going to the HOA. When I finished my calculations, the numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, I had supplied approximately $4,000 worth of propane to the Welcome Center. The reduction in my HOA fees totaled $2,700. The HOA had effectively gotten $1,300 of free propane, not counting the value of having a secure, permitted utility connection they did not have to install or maintain themselves. I sent everything to Patricia, and she called me back the next morning. This is even better than I thought. The agreement you inherited was terminable at will by either party with 30 days' notice. That means the HOA could have ended this arrangement anytime they wanted. But instead, Nancy unilaterally imposed a rule that forced you to terminate the arrangement with no notice. She has created liability for the HOA on multiple fronts. What do you want me to do? Nothing yet. I am going to draft a response to their fine letter. It is going to explain in very clear terms why their fine is invalid and why they actually owe you money. I'm also going to inform them that any further harassment or retaliation will result in a lawsuit for declaratory relief and damages. How much does something like that cost? I will do the initial letter for a flat fee of $500. If this goes to court, we can discuss hourly rates, but honestly, I don't think it will get that far. Once the HOA board sees the legal exposure Nancy has created, they will back down. These suburban HOA boards are usually reasonable people who just want their neighborhood to run smoothly. The problem is they elect zealots like Nancy who create problems where none existed. Patricia's letter arrived at the HOA office 3 days later via certified mail. I know because Nancy called me within an hour of signing for it, and she was absolutely furious. Your attorney is threatening to sue the HOA. My attorney is responding to your invalid fine and explaining the legal situation. There is a difference. You owe this community for the disruption you have caused. We have had to cancel events. Residents are complaining. Then I suggest you arrange for the Welcome Center to get its own propane supply. I gave you the name of my gas fitter. He can set up a tank and run the necessary lines. It will probably cost you around $8,000 for installation, plus the ongoing cost of propane, but that is what it takes to have an independent utility supply. Why should we pay for something we have been getting for free? You haven't been getting it for free. I have been supplying it, and the previous owner did before me. That arrangement is now terminated because you made it impossible for me to continue. None of this is my fault, Nancy. The board is meeting tomorrow night. You should be there. I will be there. The HOA board meeting took place in the Welcome Center, which was noticeably cold. The heaters were offline, and the board members were wearing jackets. About 20 residents had shown up, which was unusual. Normally, these meetings attracted maybe 5 or 6 people. Nancy sat at the head of the table with 4 other board members, 2 men and 2 women, all in their 50s or 60s. I recognized most of them from neighborhood events, but had never had any significant interactions with them. Nancy called the meeting to order and immediately launched into what she clearly intended to be a dramatic presentation about my propane tank situation. She had printed out photos of my tank in its original location and placed them on an easel. As you can see, Mr. Jensen had a massive propane tank dangerously close to his house and in full view of the street. This is exactly the kind of eyesore that degrades property values and violates our community standards. One of the residents raised her hand. Nancy, I thought this meeting was about the Welcome Center not having heat. Why are we looking at pictures of Blake's propane tank? Because Mr. Jensen deliberately sabotaged the Welcome Center's heating system in retaliation for being asked to comply with our safety rules. I stood up. That is not what happened, and you know it. Mr. Jensen, you are out of order. Sit down. No, I will not sit down. You are misrepresenting the situation to the board and these residents, and I have a right to present the actual facts. One of the male board members, a guy named Robert, gestured for me to continue. Let him speak, Nancy. We need to hear both sides. I pulled out my folder of documents and walked to the front of the room. Here are the facts. When I bought my house 3 years ago, it came with a propane tank that supplied not just my outdoor kitchen, but also this Welcome Center through a permitted underground line. The previous owner installed this system legally, with all proper permits from the city. The HOA agreed to reduce my monthly fees by $75 in exchange for me maintaining this supply. I placed copies of the original agreement on the table in front of the board members. 6 weeks ago, Nancy pushed through a new rule banning propane tanks within 25 feet of any structure. She placed a violation notice on my tank and threatened me with daily fines if I did not move it. I explained to her that moving the tank would require disconnecting the line to the Welcome Center, but she told me that was my problem, not hers. Nancy's face was turning red. That is a completely biased characterization. It is exactly what happened. Ask anyone who was in your office when we had that conversation. I turned back to the board. I hired a licensed gas fitter, properly disconnected the line with all required permits and documentation, and moved my tank to comply with Nancy's rule. The Welcome Center lost its propane supply because the geography of my property makes it impossible to maintain the connection with the tank in its new location. I placed Derek's documentation on the table. Everything was done legally and safely. The problem is that Nancy created a rule without understanding its implications. Now she has fined me $5,000 for supposedly destroying HOA property and disrupting services. But I did not destroy anything. I legally disconnected a utility line that ran from my private property to the HOA's building. That is not sabotage. That is exercising my property rights. Robert picked up the documents and started reading through them. The other board members leaned in to look over his shoulder. Nancy, did you know about this propane arrangement before you created the new rule? asked one of the women, whose name I thought was Margaret. I knew there was some kind of gas line, but I did not realize the welcome center was completely dependent on it. That seems like something you should have researched before pushing through a rule that would affect it, Robert said quietly. The rule is necessary for safety. Blake could have found a way to maintain the connection if he wanted to. He chose not to because he wanted to punish the HOA. I pulled out another document. Here is a quote from a licensed contractor for what it would cost to run a new underground line from my tank's current location to the welcome center. $18,000, plus the time and expense of getting new permits. The HOA would need to approve that expenditure, and it would take 6 to 8 weeks. Or, you could acknowledge that my original installation was grandfathered in and allow me to move the tank back. Absolutely not, Nancy said. We cannot make exceptions to the rules. Why not? Asked the other male board member, whose name was Daniel. We make exceptions all the time. The Hendersons have solar panels that extend above the roofline. The Chens have a basketball hoop that is technically in violation of the sports equipment rules. The whole point of an HOA board is to use judgment and discretion. Those are minor issues. This is a major safety concern. Robert set down the documents and looked at Nancy. Have there been any safety incidents involving Blake's propane tank in the 6 years it has been there? No, but that does not mean. Has the fire marshal or any city inspector ever cited it as a problem? Not that I am aware of, but then I am having trouble understanding why this became such a priority. Robert turned to me. Blake, if we agreed to grandfather in your installation and rescind the violation notice, would you be willing to reconnect the line to the welcome center? Yes, if the board agrees to put the arrangement in writing as a permanent easement rather than a terminable agreement. I don't want to go through this again in 2 years. That seems reasonable. Nancy, why don't you and Blake work with our attorney to draft a proper easement agreement, and we can vote on it at next month's meeting? Nancy looked like she had been slapped. The board is not seriously considering allowing Blake to violate our safety rules. I am considering whether we made a mistake in passing this particular rule without fully understanding its implications, Robert said. And based on what I am hearing tonight, I think we did. The meeting continued for another hour, with various residents weighing in. A few supported Nancy's strict interpretation of the rules, but most seemed to think the situation was absurd. The welcome center needed heat. I had a working system that had functioned safely for years. Why create a problem where none existed? By the end of the meeting, the board had voted 4-1, with only Nancy dissenting, to suspend enforcement of the propane tank rule pending a full review by the HOA attorney. They also voted unanimously to rescind my $5,000 fine. Nancy was livid. As residents filed out, she cornered me by the door. You think you won, but this is not over. I am going to find every violation on your property, and I am going to make your life miserable. That sounds like harassment, Nancy. My attorney would be very interested in documenting that kind of threat. You should have just followed the rules like everyone else. I did follow the rules. You are the one who created a rule without thinking it through, and now you are mad that you got called out for it. She opened her mouth to respond, but Robert appeared beside us. Nancy, can I talk to you for a minute? I left them and walked home, feeling a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The board had sided with me, which was good. But Nancy clearly had a vendetta now, which meant this situation was probably going to get worse before it got better. Over the next few days, I noticed Nancy driving slowly past my house multiple times. She was looking for violations, just as she had threatened. I made sure my trash cans were stored properly. My grass was trimmed to the exact specifications in the HOA rules, and my mailbox was pristine. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I came home from work to find another violation notice. This one cited my unauthorized fence modification. I stared at my fence in confusion. I had not modified anything. The fence was exactly as it had been when I bought the house. I took photos and called Patricia. "She is harassing you now," Patricia said after I explained the latest notice. "This is actually good for us in a weird way. It establishes a pattern of retaliatory conduct. Document everything. Take photos, save all notices, keep a log of every time you see Nancy drive past your house." How far is she going to take this? Hard to say. Some people like Nancy dig in and make things worse for themselves. Others back down once they realize they are creating legal liability. We will find out which type she is. The fence violation was resolved quickly once I provided photos showing that nothing had changed, but Nancy found other things to cite. My outdoor furniture was supposedly too close to the property line. My garden hose was visible from the street. My house number was half an inch too small according to a rule I had never heard of. Each violation was petty and easily disputed, but they added up to a constant barrage of harassment. I started keeping a spreadsheet documenting every notice, every sighting of Nancy near my property, and every interaction. Meanwhile, the propane situation remained unresolved. The Welcome Center was still without heat, and residents were starting to complain more loudly. Several people stopped me in the neighborhood to ask when the heat would be restored. I explained the situation as neutrally as possible, but word was spreading that Nancy had created this mess. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Robert called me at home. "Blake, I wanted to give you a heads up. We fired Nancy today." "You what?" "Well, technically, we removed her as president and from the board entirely. It required a special vote of the full membership, but we got enough signatures to call the meeting. Nancy has been sending out violation notices to anyone she thinks might have supported you at that meeting. She cited the Wilsons for having a wreath on their door 2 weeks past the allowed date. She cited the Patels for parking their car in the driveway instead of the garage. It got ridiculous." "Wow, I did not expect that." "Yeah, well, a few of us on the board started comparing notes and realized Nancy has been abusing her position for months. This propane thing was just the most obvious example. Anyway, Margaret is taking over as interim president, and one of the first things we want to do is finalize this easement agreement with you. Can you meet with us this weekend?" "Absolutely." That Saturday, I met with Robert, Margaret, and Daniel at the Welcome Center, which was still cold. The HOA attorney, a tired-looking man named Phil, had drafted an easement agreement that gave me the permanent right to maintain a propane tank on my property in its original location, and to run a supply line to the Welcome Center. In exchange, the HOA would continue the reduced monthly fee and would be responsible for half the cost of propane going forward. "This seems more than fair," I said after reviewing the document. "You are actually paying for the propane you use now." "Which we should have been doing from the beginning," Margaret said. "The previous arrangement was too one-sided. This makes it a true partnership." "When can you get the heat back on?" Daniel asked. "I will call my gas fitter today." "Probably 3 or 4 days to get everything reconnected and inspected." Derek came out on Tuesday and restored the connection. He had to dig up the capped line, verify that everything was still in good condition, and reconnect it to the tank, which we moved back to its original location. By Thursday afternoon, the Welcome Center had heat again. I thought that would be the end of it, but Nancy was not done. 2 weeks after being removed from the board, she filed a lawsuit against me personally, claiming that I had defamed her character by making false statements at the board meeting, and that I had intentionally interfered with her ability to serve as HOA president. The lawsuit was complete nonsense, and Patricia filed a motion to dismiss within days, but it still required me to spend time and money defending myself. "This is a SLAPP suit," Patricia explained. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. She is suing you to punish you for exercising your rights to speak at the board meeting. Arizona has strong anti-SLAPP laws, which means we can not only get this dismissed, but potentially recover your attorney fees from Nancy." The hearing on the motion to dismiss took place in Maricopa County Superior Court on a Monday morning in March. Nancy appeared without an attorney, which immediately told me she had no idea what she was doing. She had apparently filed the lawsuit herself using some kind of online template. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Catherine Sullivan, read through the filings quickly and then looked at Nancy. "Miss Henderson, you are suing Mr. Jensen for statements he made at a homeowner association meeting regarding a propane tank on his property. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. He lied about me and turned the board against me. I lost my position because of his false statements." "What specifically did he say that was false?" "He said I did not care about the consequences of my decisions. He made it sound like I was incompetent." "Those are opinions, Miss Henderson, not statements of fact. And from what I can see in these documents, Mr. Jensen backed up his position with extensive documentation. Did he make any factual statements that were false?" Nancy hesitated. "He said I threatened to fine him, which made me sound unreasonable." "Did you threaten to fine him?" "Well, yes, but it was a legitimate enforcement action." Judge Sullivan removed her glasses and set them on the bench. "Miss Henderson, nothing in this complaint states a viable claim for defamation. Mr. Jensen was exercising his right to participate in his community's governance. The fact that the board ultimately sided with him does not create liability. I am granting the motion to dismiss with prejudice, and I am awarding attorney fees to Mr. Jensen under Arizona's anti-SLAPP statute. You will have 30 days to pay his legal costs, which according to these filings amount to $4,500. You understand?" Nancy's face went white. "Your Honor, I cannot afford that." "Then you should not have filed a frivolous lawsuit. This case is dismissed." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a sense of relief mixed with residual anger. I had been dragged into court to defend myself against a lawsuit that never should have been filed, and even though I won, it had cost me time and stress. "The good news is you will get your money back," Patricia said as we stood on the courthouse steps. "The bad news is Nancy will probably drag her feet on paying, which means we might have to pursue collection. Can we garnish her wages or something? If it comes to that, yes, but let's give her the 30 days and see what happens." What happened was that Nancy did not pay. The 30-day deadline came and went with no check and no communication. Patricia filed the necessary paperwork to begin collection proceedings, and that apparently got Nancy's attention because she called me directly. "Blake, please. I cannot afford to pay $4,500. I made a mistake. Can we work something out? You sued me, Nancy. You dragged me into court over complete nonsense because you were angry about losing your position. Why should I cut you any slack? Because I am asking. I know I handled this whole thing wrong. I was trying to make a difference in the community, and I let it go to my head. I am sorry." I was quiet for a moment. Part of me wanted to hold firm and force her to pay every penny, but another part of me was just tired of the whole situation. "I will tell you what. If you sign a written apology acknowledging that you filed a frivolous lawsuit and that all my actions regarding the propane tank were legal and proper, I will reduce the amount you owe to $2,000. You can pay it over 6 months, and I will not pursue garnishment." I can do that. Thank you, Blake. Really. Nancy signed the apology letter 3 days later, and she made her first payment the following week. I never framed the letter or made it public. The situation had already caused enough drama in the neighborhood, and I did not see any point in humiliating Nancy further. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal. Margaret turned out to be a competent and reasonable HOA president. The Welcome Center had reliable heat. My propane tank sat peacefully in its original location, properly permitted and documented. About 6 months after the lawsuit was dismissed, I ran into Nancy at the grocery store. She looked smaller somehow, less aggressive. We made eye contact and she gave me a small nod. "How are you doing?" I asked, surprising myself. "Getting by. I am not on the board anymore, obviously." "Probably for the best. I think I was trying too hard to make everything perfect." "The HOA does not need perfect, it just needs functional." "Yeah, I am learning that." She paused. "For what it is worth, I really am sorry about all of it. The propane thing, the lawsuit, all of it." "You were right, and I was wrong." "I appreciate that." We went our separate ways, and I never had another significant interaction with Nancy Henderson. She kept making her payments on time, and the final check arrived in early October. I deposited it, closed out the file with Patricia, and considered the entire saga finished. The following year, I was asked to join the HOA board myself. I declined, having had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. But I did agree to serve on a committee reviewing the community's rules and bylaws. We streamlined about 40% of them, eliminating outdated or overly restrictive provisions. The propane tank rule was one of the first to go. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My propane tank is still in its original spot, supplying both my outdoor kitchen and the Welcome Center. The easement agreement remains in place, and the HOA pays its share of the propane costs without complaint. Every now and then, when I am grilling on my back patio, I think about the orange violation sticker that started it all and shake my head. The entire situation could have been avoided if Nancy had just taken the time to understand what she was regulating before slapping down rules. But I guess that is the nature of HOA disputes. Someone gets a little power, decides they need to use it, and creates problems where none existed. The key is having enough documentation, enough patience, and if necessary, a good attorney who knows property law. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Document everything. Know your rights. Read your covenants and your local laws. And if the HOA is depending on your property for something, make sure that arrangement is properly documented and fairly compensated. The moment Nancy forced me to move that tank, she terminated an arrangement that was highly favorable to the HOA. All because she did not bother to ask the right questions or consider the consequences. In the end, the community got a better HOA board, I got a better easement agreement, and Nancy Henderson learned an expensive lesson about the limits of HOA authority. The Welcome Center stayed warm. My propane tank became a properly documented part of the community infrastructure, and life went on. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just ignored that orange sticker. Would Nancy have followed through on her threat to fine me daily? Would the board have supported her? It is impossible to know. But by taking the exact action she demanded, by moving that tank and cutting off the Welcome Center's heat, I forced everyone to confront the reality of the situation Nancy had created. It was uncomfortable. It was disruptive, and it made people angry. But it also cut through all the posturing and rhetoric and made the actual stakes crystal clear. The HOA needed my propane tank. Nancy's rule made it impossible for me to supply it. Therefore, Nancy's rule was a problem. Once the board understood that chain of causation, the resolution became obvious. They could either lose their heating system permanently, or they could acknowledge that sometimes rules need exceptions. I learned something from the experience, too. I learned that HOA boards are made up of regular people, most of whom are reasonable and want to do the right thing. The problem is when one person, someone like Nancy, gets on a crusade and stops listening to feedback. That is when you end up with situations like mine, where a simple safety regulation that sounded reasonable in the abstract turned into a major conflict with real consequences. It is easy to make rules. It is much harder to understand how those rules will interact with the complex reality of a community where different properties have different histories, different setups, and different needs. A good HOA board recognizes that complexity and uses discretion. A bad HOA board treats the rules as absolute and refuses to acknowledge when they are causing more problems than they solve. Margaret's leadership style was completely different from Nancy's. Where Nancy saw every issue as a battle to be won, Margaret saw them as puzzles to be solved. When residents came to her with problems, she asked questions, gathered information, and tried to find solutions that worked for everyone. The difference in how the community functioned was remarkable. Under Nancy, there had been a constant low-level tension, a sense that you were always one step away from a violation notice for some minor infraction. Under Margaret, people relaxed. The rules were still there, but they were enforced with common sense rather than rigid absolutism. Property values stayed stable, the neighborhood looked good, and people actually enjoyed living there again. I think about that sometimes when I hear stories about other HOA disputes around Phoenix. There are horror stories of people being fined thousands of dollars for trivial violations, of neighbors turned against each other over mailbox colors and holiday decorations. Most of those situations could be avoided with better leadership and a recognition that the purpose of an HOA is to maintain property values and quality of life, not to exercise control for its own sake. My propane tank still sits 8 feet from my house, properly secured and maintained. The underground line still runs to the welcome center, providing heat and cooking fuel. And every month, the HOA sends me a check for half the propane costs, honoring the agreement we forged in the aftermath of Nancy's disastrous attempt to regulate something she did not understand. It is not a perfect system. Nothing is. But it works, it is fair, and it serves the needs of both me and the community, which is really all you can ask from an HOA arrangement. The orange sticker that started this whole mess is in a folder in my filing cabinet, along with all the other documentation from those chaotic few months. I keep it as a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with an unreasonable demand is to comply with it so completely that everyone can see how unreasonable it was. Nancy wanted my propane tank moved. I moved it. The consequences she refused to consider became immediately and undeniably real. And that reality forced a resolution that never would have happened if I had just argued and complied half-heartedly. There is a lesson in that, I think. Not just about HOAs, but about any situation where someone is exercising authority without wisdom. Sometimes you have to let them see the full consequences of what they are demanding. It is uncomfortable and it causes short-term problems. But in the long run, it is often the only way to create real change. The welcome center is warm now. My attorney fees are paid. The lawsuit is dismissed. The neighborhood has moved on, and every time I grill a steak on my back patio, I appreciate the fact that my propane tank is exactly where it belongs, serving both my needs and the community's, properly documented and fairly compensated. That orange sticker tried to disrupt something that was working fine, but in the end, all it did was make the arrangement stronger and more legally sound. Nancy learned her lesson. I got a better easement, and the community got a better HOA board. As far as I am concerned, that is about as good an ending as you could hope for from an HOA dispute. Nobody ended up in jail, nobody lost their house, and eventually, everyone moved on. The propane still flows, the heat still works, and life in Meadowbrook Estates continues as it should. Sometimes that is the best victory you can get. Not dramatic vindication, but simple functionality and peace.